It's a commonly held belief that communism and nationalism don't mix. Workers of the world unite, nothing to lose but your chains, Soviet Union fighting the Nazis. Most of you know the drill. As far as what communists are supposed to identify with, the nation was at best secondary to class, and it was just capitalist nonsense at worst. And yet, in at least several cases, nationalism and communism coexisted, including in Romania. Under the rule of the Romanian Communist Party, nationalist narratives were promoted, taught in schools, and even shown in movies. Of course, they didn't outright call it nationalism, but instead referred to the people or the motherland. So, how did this work? I'm your host David, and today we are going to talk about Romania, its ideology, foreign policy, and the rise to power of its most notorious leader, conductor, the genius of the Carpathians, Nicolae Ceausescu. This is the Cold War. To start, some context. Romania is a country in Eastern Europe. Too basic? Okay. During the Second World War, the Romanian government had sided with Nazi Germany. However, by 1944, the King of Romania, Michael I, noticed that the Red Army had advanced to just outside his kingdom's borders. Knowing what was coming, he decided to pull an Italy, and he switched sides. The Soviets rewarded this gesture by, well, not killing him. But in 1947, the monarchy was deposed, and Romania became a People's Republic. One of this channel's very early videos looked at the Sovietization of Romania, so if you haven't, please check it out. By the end of 1947, the Romanian Workers' Party was in charge. But there is a fascinating aspect to this that runs contrary to much popular conception as to how these authoritarian governments worked. The party was not a unified monolith, and there was actually a fierce ongoing internal struggle until the mid-1950s. The different wings of the party didn't differ that much ideologically, but they were separated by their different experiences, their origin stories, if you will. One wing had spent the Second World War in Romanian prisons. The other, the so-called Muscovites, had spent the war in exile in the Soviet Union. As the internal power struggle continued after 1947, and after several rounds of purges, Gheorghiu-Dej emerged as the winner. He was a former railway worker and a former inmate at the Târgu Jiu internment camp, where he had spent the war years, emerging as the leader of the prison faction. With his consolidation of power, the Muscovite faction was mostly silenced or marginalized. At this point of the story, we should recall that Romania, along with other countries in the Eastern Bloc, was a part of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or ComiCon. The Soviets had created this organization as a response to the Marshall Plan as a way to encourage interdependence in trade and production between member states, but under Stalin, it didn't see much activity, not in Romania at the very least. But things changed after Stalin died and Khrushchev established himself. He pushed to centralize ComiCon and, more importantly, to emphasize production specialization. The more developed nations in the Eastern Bloc, such as Czechoslovakia or East Germany, would be the industrial drivers of the community, while the role of countries like Romania and Bulgaria was to act as a source of raw materials and agricultural produce. Bucharest was, of course, opposed to this plan. Romania wanted to develop its own heavy industry, and honestly, this production specialization sounded a lot like capitalist division of labor. To protect themselves from this plan, Romanian leaders argued that it was up to Bucharest to decide what happened to Romania and her economy. The issue went public. To secure its plans to industrialize, Romania extended the list of countries they bought raw materials from, and it included places like India and Brazil. Khrushchev attempted to sell the ComiCon idea to Romanians anyway, but eventually he was forced to concede. After the events in both Poland and Hungary in 1956, the last thing he wanted to see was another conflict within the Eastern Bloc, after all. So that had all taken place during the early 1960s, during which the Sino-Soviet split was deepening and widening. Romania had initially sided with the Soviets, with the notion that the Chinese communists were too dogmatic, too hawkish, and too inclined to adventurous foreign policy. While Gheorghiu-Dej was no angel, he was more dovish. Mao's arguments about how a global nuclear war was allegedly beneficial for the spread of socialism didn't help him to win friends. The problem was, though, that the Soviets had just sent nuclear weapons to Cuba. No one had consulted Gheorghiu-Dej, of course, but nevertheless, Romania, as a Soviet ally, was on the verge of entering a nuclear holocaust without ever agreeing to the role. Okay, now with that and the ComiCon issue in mind, Gheorghiu-Dej went for amending ties with China. Both the Romanian and Chinese presses stopped vilifying each other, and Romanian politicians even started to theorize what a cultural revolution would look like in their country. One other aspect to consider was that, like Mao, Gheorghiu-Dej wasn't a fan of de-Stalinization. So in the Sino-Soviet split, Romania took a neutral position, not out of love for China, but rather to preserve its own autonomy. In April 1964, the Declaration of the Romanian Workers' Party position in the international communist and workers' movement problems was released. It's better known under a shorter name, the Independence Declaration. There, the RWP proclaimed that all communist parties were equal and were free to choose their own path towards communism. The implication was that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was just one of many equal parties, and therefore could not be considered justified in forcing other parties to follow its lead. A move like this had simply not been possible in the 1940s. After all, the Romanian Workers' Party was put in charge and propped up by the Soviets, relying on Soviet bayonets to remain in power. Dissent against communist rule was met with terror, disappearances, imprisonment, the Romanian equivalent of the Gulag, and denial of basic civil rights. After the Hungarian Revolution failed in 1956, more and more people understood that help against the authoritarian regime was not coming, that resistance was futile, and that the best option was to accept communist rule and move on as best as they could. There was acceptance, if not love. For the Romanian Workers' Party, this was a chance to rely on its own people then, rather than on a foreign beneficiary. Already by 1961, a party plenum provided a narrative of the history of the party. There, the group of Gheorghiu-Dej, the anti-fascist inmates of the Second World War, was presented as both patriotic and devoted to the Romanian people. The opposing group, the Muscovites, were painted as obedient pawns, acting only in the interests of the Soviet Union. In the cultural sphere, Bucharest worked extensively to limit its ties with Moscow. The Maxim Gorky Institute, where Russian language and literature was taught, was partially abolished, and what was left was incorporated into a wider Slavicist faculty. Romania stopped jamming Western radio broadcasts and allowed more plays, books, and movies to arrive from the West. Roughly at the same time this was going on, a lucky discovery was made in the Dutch archives. A number of manuscripts describing the oppression of 19th century Romanians by the Russian Empire were uncovered. And importantly, they had been written by none other than Karl Marx. Tsarist imperialism, according to Marx, was against, quote, the fundamental rights of the Romanian people to settle the internal affairs of the country on its own will. Marx continued, these provinces have withered at the shadow of Russian protection. To be suspected of nurturing patriotic feelings equated with the exclusion from public offices. The slavishness regarding Russia's interests was a promotion tool. From prince to the most modest functionary, they all knew that their job was at the mercy of the Russian consul. The Romanian peasant nurtures for the Muscovite only hatred. Talk about history repeating itself, right? The book was printed for public use, and needless to say, the Soviet Union was in no position to argue against Karl Marx. So this broadly became Romania's tactic, to argue its point of view by relying on communist ideology. For example, when explaining its position in the Sino-Soviet split. Quoting Lenin during the public polemic, CPSU refers only to the peaceful way to reach socialism, and the Chinese Communist Party only the violent way. Our party and its declaration of April 1964 quotes Lenin entirely. With the transformation in Romania's policy accomplished, Gheorghiu-Dej then opted for a general amnesty. In 1964, political prisoners were released, and the brutalities of Stalin's terror gave way to more delicate and persuasive methods of repression. The next year, however, Gheorghiu-Dej died of cancer. The events that followed are subject to some debate. The ultimate fact is that the leadership of the party was assumed by Nicolae Ceausescu. It's the details that have been open to interpretation and conjecture. One narrative claims that the death of Gheorghiu-Dej was a big surprise, that the party had to improvise, and that a relatively young and inexperienced Ceausescu was a compromised choice. But another interpretation says that Ceausescu's rise to power was far from an accident. He was one of Gheorghiu-Dej's former inmates, and the two had shared a prison cell while interned during the war years. Ceausescu came from a proletarian background. He'd been a shoemaker's apprentice. For an aspiring communist, that's a good background to have. He had evaded the purges of the early 1950s and quickly climbed the rungs of power. At the age of just 37, he was made a member of the Politburo. It has been claimed that Gheorghiu-Dej regarded Ceausescu as his successor, and his election was made possible by the old guard of the party. Ceausescu initially had to rely on this old guard, but over time he solidified his own political support, establishing himself firmly at the top of the political pyramid. We are going to talk about his somewhat bizarre cult of personality in a future episode, but we want enough time to do that topic justice, so that will come another day. With Ceausescu in, Romania then found it was not the only socialist country to change leaders in the mid-1960s. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev was ousted from power. The new leader, Leonid Brezhnev, aimed to restore Soviet prestige and influence in the Eastern Bloc, and the Sino-Soviet conflict was once again brought back into the spotlight. In 1967, an international conference of communist parties was to be held in the Czechoslovakian city of Karlovy Vary. Moscow's goal was simple: to get a joint declaration from attendees which would condemn China. Ceausescu was now in trouble. To support the Soviets meant to abandon Romanian autonomy. Not participating in the conference meant becoming another Albania. The only remaining option was to participate, yet somehow prevent the joint denunciation. Romania's official stance became one of unity between all of the world's communist movements. After multiple rounds of talks, Romania refused to participate if they would have to publicly criticize another communist party. Brezhnev tried to convince Ceausescu and even brought in Tito as a mediator. Ceausescu was unimpressed and even turned Tito to his side. In the end, the conference took place without Romania, Albania, and Yugoslavia. Brezhnev argued virulently against China, but in the end, no official document blamed China for anything. Things were not over, however. There was another conference scheduled in Budapest for the next year. The Soviets had made it clear to Ceausescu that another boycott would result in isolation, and going full Albania was never in Romania's plans. Ceausescu agreed to participate, but only after he got a promise from the Soviets that there would be no required criticism of other parties. In Budapest, Romanians would discover that Moscow's promises could be devious at best. While the Soviet delegation did keep quiet about China, it had other delegations to speak for them. After a fierce verbal attack against China by the East Germans, the Romanian delegation protested, only to be attacked itself. Of all the delegations attending, the Syrian one was especially hostile. Romania was accused of ignoring internationalist duties and also of not breaking off diplomatic relations with Israel. The Romanian delegation left the meeting in protest. Ceausescu was disgusted by the incident. In the plenum of the Central Committee of the party, he explained, quote, "The meeting was only a smokescreen, a delusion so that behind this conference, a leading center of the communist and workers' movement could be imposed, the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This is the reality, comrades, and we have to look at it the way it is. To accept this would mean putting handcuffs on our hands, betraying the interests of the people, of the communist movement, and I think our party cannot accept this." Tensions were reaching a boiling point. 2 months later, the Ukrainian party leadership accused Romania of betraying socialist solidarity and propagating nationalist and irredentist ideas. They also claimed that the Soviet Union would not allow Romania to paralyze the Warsaw Pact. As Ceausescu and the rest of the world was soon to learn, Brezhnev didn't mind putting down insubordination by force. In the early morning of August 21, 1968, reports began to arrive in Bucharest that the Soviet army had invaded Czechoslovakia. Ceausescu consulted with the party, and at 1:10 p.m. he gave a speech that would make him the most popular man in Romania. The 5 socialist countries' invasion into Czechoslovakia is a big mistake and a severe threat to peace in Europe and to the fate of socialism in the world. There is no justification and no reason to accept for even a second even the idea of a military intervention in the internal affairs of a kindred socialist state. It was said that the danger of counter-revolution loomed in Czechoslovakia. Tomorrow, perhaps they will find people to claim that even our meeting displayed counter-revolutionary tendencies. We must answer one and all that the Romanian people will not allow anyone to trespass on our land. One would assume that something big was supposed to happen next, like Romania leaving the Warsaw Pact, or maybe a number of Romanian officials mysteriously falling out of windows. But that didn't happen. Ceausescu actually worked to do everything he could to avoid escalation. At the next International Communist Conference, both the Soviets and Romanians avoided any talks about Prague and the Brezhnev Doctrine. Ceausescu still protested any criticism levied at China, but he no longer threatened to leave ComiCon or the Warsaw Pact. In the end, no joint condemnation was made, and the status quo was preserved. But something different did begin to emerge in the period after the speech. The ideology of National-Communism, already somewhat present in Romania, reached its heyday. At its cornerstone was Romania's independence, its sovereignty, and its resistance to foreign influence. And there was a conscious effort to promote this ideology. Ceausescu's domestic visits were staged so that the national leader could publicly admire distant history, especially the deeds of medieval Romanian rulers. As the narrative claimed, princes like Stephen the Great or Michael the Brave protected Romania from the Ottomans. Ceausescu and the Communist Party continued their work and protected Romania from the Soviets. State propaganda also put some emphasis on the kings of ancient Dacia, Revista and Détente. An effort was made to establish an unbreakable union between the party and ethnic Romanians. But as I am sure that many of you are aware, Romania is not a mono-ethnic state. A side effect of this Romania centrism was the mistreatment of ethnic minorities. Non-Romanians just didn't fit into the picture. Germans and Jews were expected to leave Romania and resettle elsewhere. The large Hungarian minority, largely concentrated in Transylvania, was to be assimilated. Although the Hungarians were obviously unhappy with this set of events, the ideology did resonate well with Romanians. This defiant stance against Soviet aggression was a source of pride and of national dignity. An even more important reason for national pride, however, stemmed from Romania's social transformation. Its urban population grew rapidly, and so did the literacy rate. Radio and then television spread rapidly into rural areas. For millions of Romanians, their life quality improved and came into contact with other Romanians. Nation building thrives under these conditions, and Romanian identity flourished. Movies can often be a strong indicator of this process. In 1967, Sergiu Nicolaescu released the movie Daci, or The Dacians. It told the story of the conquest of ancient Dacia by the Romanians and presented Romanians as a Dacian-Roman synthesis. This is the second most watched Romanian movie of all time, only surpassed by Nicolaescu's next work. In 1971, he released Mihai Viteazul, or Michael the Brave. The message of the movie was unity and independence. Think of it like a Romanian Braveheart. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, actually, Mel Gibson was not around, and freedom was not on the list of Ceausescu's priorities. National Communism would give birth to his notorious personality cult, and the process of industrialization was funded heavily by international loans, whose repayment would lead to harsh austerity programs. The next time Ceausescu would try and arouse the public with a major speech, he would, spoiler alert, end up deposed and executed. The Romanian Revolution was a Christmas gift for many, but it would not be a velvet one. This, however, will be a subject of a future video, so to make sure you don't miss it, press the subscribe and the bell button, but be sure to apply somewhat equal pressure. If you choose favorites, the button community may be split over how not to miss our future content. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.